Welcome everyone to Ether Media. Today we are going to talk about a book, very important book that's published this month. We're going to talk to the writer, journalist Phil Miller, who wrote this book. This book is called Keenie Meenie. There will be a publication event on 9th Sunday from 2 to 5 p.m. in Indian YMCA near Tottenham Court Road. Before that, we're going to hear from Phil Miller, who wrote this book in terms of what is in it and why this important book, and we will discuss that. There is also movies made about this particular findings in the book. We'll also give you a trailer of that movie. You can have a look at it.
When I was in the Special Air Service, everyone knew about KMS. Keenie Meenie Services. It's just a term used by soldiers for people who are very keen and nasty.
They were not official government, they were a private firm, mostly from ex-SAS. Well, I think they killed people, basically.
As he flew over the area, his door gunner opened up and shot every man, woman, child and animal that he could get his eyes on.
A whole bloody lot had been dropped on the Tamils with grenades inside them.
I think there are equities that belong to other governments that are at stake here.
There were one or two British politicians who were connected to the company.
இந்த கம்பெனிக்கு இந்த பிரிட்டிஷ் கவர்மெண்ட்டும் ஒரு ஆதரவாக இருக்குன்னு நினைக்க அதிர்ச்சி அளிக்குது.
I wasn't happy with the role that I was being asked to fulfill. There were a lot of undercurrents that were immoral.
Hello, Lieutenant Colonel Beatty.
Bugger off.
Do you accept any personal responsibility for war crimes that were committed in Sri Lanka, sir?
You're on my land. Get out.
Welcome, Phil, to the Ether Media. First of all, this is an important book. First, explain to the viewers, what is Keenie Meenie? What is it?
Yes,
Keenie Meenie is the title.
Yeah, Keenie Meenie Services is the name of this British mercenary company that was active in Sri Lanka in the 1980s. It's not entirely certain what this name means, so there are different reasons why people think it has this name. Some people say it's Arabic for some kind of undercover operation. Other people say it's Swahili. And one former Keenie Meenie mercenary that I spoke to said it's just a saying for soldiers who are very keen and nasty at their jobs. So yeah, there's a whole sort of intrigue around the company's name.
Very strange name for a company like that.
Yeah.
What they do basically?
Yeah, so they do a whole range of services, from things like bodyguarding all the way up to sabotage and piloting helicopter gunships. And that is something that they did particularly in Sri Lanka.
Yeah. Before we go into that, but this is a kind of a military personnel involved in it, isn't it?
Yeah, so the company was set up by former SAS commanders, and they then recruited other former SAS members. So the SAS is the British
basically while they're doing in duty or after duty.
So it's a bit of a mixture. Some of them had retired, others were still serving as what they're called reserves in the British Army.
So basically it's a military personnel, security personnel who kind of specialize on, it's a private company, isn't it? It's not linked to the government, get money from all the people, operate. But some of them, while serving in reserve as well, on the official capital, getting that money, as well as private operation getting that money as well.
Exactly. So there's this kind of grey area between who's really responsible for the company. And it also had these quite high-level political connections as well to the government of the day.
So the Keenie Meenie, the KMS for short, they operated in many countries from the 70s, isn't it? Many countries, and one country is Sri Lanka. Just give us an idea in terms of why they go there and what capacity who invite them, kind of initial understanding why it happens. Because there is lack of understanding of a private company and official military and so on.
Yeah. So it was around 1983. President Jayawardeneh felt that he couldn't control the Tamil uprising, and he turned to Britain, the old colonial power, for help. And at first he asked for official British army troops to come and help him. But Britain felt that this would upset India. India at that time was supporting the Tamil autonomy, and Britain was selling a lot of arms to India, so they were worried about losing arms sales and other business deals with India. So one of Margaret Thatcher's top advisors suggested that this operation could be privatised, it could be outsourced. And it's not totally clear from the British government files, but at some point the name Keenie Meenie comes into circulation. And President Jayawardeneh in particular is kind of impressed by what they've done in Oman, where there was another kind of uprising for autonomy against a very dictatorial regime in Oman, and the company was involved in counterinsurgency work there. So it had this particular reputation of being able to handle uprisings, and I think that's why President Jayawardeneh wanted them.
So they had a history in Oman and Nicaragua prior to this. So
in Oman by this stage, the Nicaragua stuff came later. Yeah.
So Oman, they already had a history in terms of how to deal with uprising, how to deal with this kind of situation and so on. Yeah. So they brought that skill to Sri Lanka. So in Sri Lanka, you mention in the book in terms of they're directly responsible for massacres, killings. Just explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so the most direct responsibility that the company had for war crimes in Sri Lanka was when its staff were working as pilots in Sri Lankan Air Force helicopters and helicopter gunships. So this is where they were directly involved. In some cases, the helicopters had pod guns, so the pilot could pull the trigger. And KMS pilot, at least one KMS pilot has admitted to doing that. In other cases, they would fly the aircraft whilst the door gunners, who were Sinhalese, would fire at whatever they wanted to target below, which was often
So
civilians.
How did we know that? I know we don't want to reveal everything. I think everybody should read the book. Important book. It's a very important revelation in terms of what actually happened. Extremely important for us to read this and understand what went on. But how do we know, if we can reveal some aspect in terms of this, KMS involved in it, not the Sri Lankan army?
Yeah.
How do we know that?
So,
apart from just admission on one person.
Yeah, so the main source that I've used is at the National Archives in London. The UK government's files about Sri Lanka, all the diplomatic dispatches, have been, well, some of them have been declassified from this period. Others are still censored, others have been destroyed.
It's still hiding lots of information.
Yeah.
Yes.
But from what I've been able to get access to, you can see reports there from people like the defence attaché, who was a British military officer stationed at the High Commission in Colombo. And he had a lot of contact, so meetings with Keenie Meenie staff in Colombo. He also went on helicopters to visit different parts of the island and would note that he was flown by
they're directly
pilots.
involved,
Yeah. And I was actually able to track down this person and interview him as well.
Right.
So that added more detail than what was in the files.
So I think there is kind of, you have established that the KMS at least responsible for killing as well. It's easy to pull the trigger. At the time, if in your research, did you see how many helicopters were flying? And is it mostly done by KMS, helicopter gunships, or what do you think? I mean,
yeah, so the Sri Lankan Air Force faced a shortage of experienced combat pilots at the start of the uprising.
How to deal with, where to fire and all these things.
Exactly. Apart from the 71 JVP uprising, the military had mainly had a kind of ceremonial role, and it certainly hadn't had to engage in offensive air operations. Whereas Britain had lots of pilots with experience of flying in Ireland, in Oman, in lots of conflicts around the world. So they brought that experience, and the argument KMS tried to make was that they were just co-pilots who were training up the Sri Lankan pilots, and soon they wouldn't need to be there. But actually they were there for I think at least 3 years. And often,
from the period from 86 to 89 period,
I think from 85 they first went out there.
So
several years after that.
So they were like probably 11 pilots there, but they're guiding them.
Yeah.
So at one point they killed on one spot 85 people.
Yeah, so this was the Kokadichi Kolai prawn farm massacre in 1987, the anniversary of which is later this January. And this was so a prawn farm in the east of Sri Lanka, and they went in with helicopters, also army and the special task force, which was almost set up from scratch by Keenie Meenie.
Wow.
It hardly existed prior to the arrival of Keenie Meenie. And that was one of the first jobs that Keenie Meenie did when they came to Sri Lanka.
Basically, you're saying the Sri Lankan STF, the Special Task Force, kind of created by the Keenie Meenie.
Yeah. There's lots of evidence for that, and even former members of the Special Task Force are quite proud of this involvement.
So they all went together. Why they attacked this farm? Why, you don't want to reveal everything, but why they just suddenly killing like that?
Well, I think they had some indication that there was some kind of Tamil militant base in this area.
Oh, right, okay.
But I've been to that location and I've spoken to survivors, and there were certainly a lot of civilians there who were killed, and there's a large memorial there by the roadside as well. So I think it's particularly in that period as well. I mean, now obviously with everything else that's happened in Sri Lanka, there have been so many larger massacres since. But at that period in the conflict, this was seen as a particularly bad massacre, and you can kind of see the cycle of violence escalating. Actually,
one of the first big killing actually.
Okay.
So basically, at that time, in the early days of the 85 to 89 period, there's not big massive killings even by the Sri Lankan force. Basically, British taught them how to kill. Basically, is that what you're saying?
Well, you can trace a pattern. So when Keenie Meenie arrived and they started training the Special Task Force, you had an incident in September 1984 in Point Pedro when the Hartley College Library, not the Jaffna, but the Hartley College Library, was burnt down, and around a dozen civilians were killed by the SDF, who'd just been trained by Keenie Meenie.
All right.
If you go 3 years later, you have this much larger massacre where 85 people are killed. So Keenie Meenie it said at the time it was instilling professionalism and discipline in the troops that it trained. But actually, if you look at what happened, the massacres got far worse.
Far worse, and suddenly they just don't care. They can't differentiate between the militants and the locals, and they just kill them all. That's the kind of thing that's happened in the later stage of the war. We're all, militant, we'll kill you all. Basically, that started that kind of looking at everybody as a block and kill them. Is with the Keenie Meenie. You are tracing the kind of pattern to the Keenie Meenie kind of at the early stages. Is that correct?
You particularly see this with the helicopter pilots. I mean, obviously when you're high up in the air, it's harder to distinguish who you're targeting, but one of the KMS pilots kept a war diary, and initially he was trying to distinguish between civilians and combatants. By the end of it, he says things like to beat the Tamils we had to blow away the whole village. So his kind of attitudes totally changed while he was out there.
Yeah, it's not the kind of the military aspect of the operational kind. This Kotabaya, what they did towards the end, it's come from that pattern. You're tracing back that pattern to Keenie Meenie and the British themselves. Yeah. The thing is also they are private companies. Who are paying them at that stage?
So at this point, the Sri Lankan government were paying them several millions of pounds to do this work.
Nobody knows that.
Yeah, that in itself is a revelation. So there's a telegram that I found written by one of the British ambassador in Sri Lanka at the time, where he talks, he says this is costing the Sri Lankan government millions of pounds each year. But we still don't have the precise figures. So that's something that perhaps people in Sri Lanka could try and find out.
So did you had a chance to contact the Sri Lankan government to get a response in terms of what did you pay to kill?
So they released various material that I've used throughout this process, and some of my colleagues were actually able to speak to retired and serving members of the Sri Lankan forces, and they are very proud of what Keenie Meenie did in Sri Lanka. They and you see this particularly in the film as well. They really praise the company for what it. I've seen people say that if it wasn't for Keenie Meenie, they wouldn't have been able to get through that period of the conflict. And actually, if you look at kind of before mid-1985, the Tamil movement had kind of militarily, it had the upper hand. And there were the peace talks in Thimphu in Bhutan, where there was kind of an amazing show of unity by the different Tamil forces, and the Sri Lankan government actually used that ceasefire to rearm and particularly get the Keenie Meenie pilots into the helicopters. And then you start to see that ceasefire break down, and then you see a lot more of these aerial massacres from the helicopters. And obviously, if you're a guerrilla movement without your own air force, suddenly the people you're fighting have air power. You're at a massive disadvantage.
Sure. So do you think that during the IPKF period of very horrendous killing and various things going on, at the time I was on the ground in Sri Lanka, at the time I was a little boy, and then there's a lot of helicopters, they come first, they shoot, merciless, and then you run for hiding basically, and then comes the kind of troops and etc. etc. So the Keenie Meenie probably trained and took part possibly at the time shooting at us basically.
So there's after the IPKF arrived, there's some indication that Keenie Meenie scaled back its activities. They weren't as needed because obviously there were so many Indian troops on the island, but certainly they stayed at the Special Task Force training camp throughout at least some of the IPKF time.
You have published evidences of photographs, etc. Yeah.
So this is all in the book, and there's a couple of pages on their role in the IPKF time.
And the kind of another question is that I know you mentioned before in your book, and the thing is there is the kind of the Tamil and Muslims relationship is damaged. And you're arguing that Keenie Meenie also played a part in it. Can you explain a little bit?
Yeah. So I think it was around 1985. There was a series of Tamil Muslim riots in the eastern province. And if you look at reports from that time, you see accounts of the Special Task Force, which had been trained by Keenie Meenie, was, in some cases, aiding and abetting the Muslims to attack the Tamils. And it was also not intervening to stop the riots and not intervening to protect the Tamils.
Why is that? Where is this kind of strategy?
So at that point in the conflict, there was actually quite a lot of unity between Tamils and Muslims. You see reports of Muslims joining different groups. Exactly.
Old tactics of the British imperialism.
Precisely. Obviously, if the eastern province, if the Muslims and the Tamils had been united, that could have been a huge challenge to Colombo. And then suddenly you see these splits emerging, and the Special Task Force having a clear role in making those splits. Now, whether Keenie Meenie taught them to do that, I'm not able to ascertain, but there are certainly serious questions there for Keenie Meenie to answer about their role in that period.
Yeah, so they played a part in that as well, like harboring this, and Kottaba even now they use that same tactics and so on. It is kind of telling because the British imperialism is what trained them. Kind of at the time of the independence, the bourgeois. There are a lot of documents. I also used some of them in one of the book I wrote. The thing is, in terms of how they are not ready to govern, because there is a threat of left. They were fearing that it's going to go over. Do you think, because of the Tory government at the time, Thatcher, do you think that's also a political motivation, do you think?
Yeah, I think they certainly saw, so the British government under Thatcher certainly saw Jayawardeneh as an ally. He shared their kind of right-wing politics, and also he was seen as kind of a bulwark against the Soviet Union. So they were concerned about the Soviets getting a foothold in Sri Lanka, particularly in Trincomalee Harbour. And so they felt it was much better that Britain was supplying, albeit discreetly, military aid to Sri Lanka, rather than allow or make Sri Lanka feel the need to ask the Soviet Union for military assistance.
British imperialism, the role of British imperialism in your colonial countries is very important to understand what they did. In Sri Lanka, while they do, even at the time, early stages, like you said, they're not very well equipped. During the JVP uprising, they didn't have any helicopters. The external factors, how the British helped to arm and how to protect them in the fear of kind of left takeover. There's another country, which is an important country, Nicaragua, where there's a potential opportunity existed for the masses to kind of take power or change the country for benefit of all, etc. There's a rebellion, revolution, etc. And British send the mercenaries.
Yeah, so what's quite interesting about Keenie Meenie is it would either help right-wing governments stay in power against left-wing opposition, or if there was a left-wing government in power, it would help to overthrow it.
Overthrow it.
So in Nicaragua, by 1985, there was a democratically elected left-wing government in power. And what Keenie Meenie started to do was help the Contras, who were funded by the CIA, to engage in sabotage operations. So there's a particular case in the capital of Nicaragua where an arms depot and a hospital was blown up. And this case, it later transpired, was Keenie Meenie were responsible for this operation. So that's, they were definitely trying to help maintain kind of right-wing forces around the world. And also in the book, I kind of talk a bit more about the kind of longer-term trajectory of how Britain used mercenaries. So, of course, the East India Company, which Britain used to colonise most of South Asia, was a mercenary enterprise. And if you go to the Foreign Office today, they have an open day every year where you can go in and look around. They have this courtyard, it's called the Durbar Courtyard, in the middle, and it's like the centerpiece of the building. And all around the courtyard, you have these statues to former members of the East India Company. So they're still very much kind of part of the fabric of that building and the people who work there. So it's kind of not surprising to see that the Foreign Office is so happy to kind of turn a blind eye to mercenaries when it suits them.
But it's to this day, it carries on, isn't it? But, you know, the question is it actually carries on? It's a question because if the Thatcher moved to kind of legalize aspect of it and trying to kind of change it, is it a cover-up or a genuine attempt? And then government since then, are they cautious about using mercenaries in terms of how they're looking at it? Or they do it, they cover up, it's the same tradition carries on. What's the situation?
Yeah, so Keenie Meenie itself, it kind of blazed a trail until the late 1980s when its work in Nicaragua was exposed in the US congressional hearings. And after that, the company changed its name and kind of took on a lower profile, and other companies became more prolific. So companies like Executive Outcomes and Sandline International, and even Margaret Thatcher's son, Mark Thatcher, was convicted in South Africa for playing a role in the coup in Equatorial Guinea. So there are kind of repeats of this, and very little has changed in terms of any legal framework to stop it from happening again. What I would say is because Britain's SAS, Special Forces, is still so opaque, there's so little transparency to that part of the military, the UK government is still able to kind of do a lot of these operations directly and not have to tell the public about it.
Yeah.
So it hasn't needed to privatise it all as much as perhaps it would do if we had a more transparent Special Forces unit.
Yeah, but they're not going to have a transparent. Like even in Iraq now, they have mercenaries, British and the US, and so on. We're never going to find out actually what happens in our time. Maybe 10 years down the line or 30 years down the line, some information may be released. Even this has happened about so long ago, 30 years ago. Still, we don't have the full information.
Yeah, it's very frustrating how much information is still classified or has been destroyed.
Yeah, mostly secret operation, but private company.
Yeah.
It's not even a government company.
Yeah. What I would say is some of the UK's allies, even the US, are actually more transparent when it comes to, say, the CIA archives or some kind of declassification regime. So I don't think it's impossible for a country like this to be more transparent, but I think there's this culture of secrecy. And there's also people who've done very unsavoury things who are still alive and don't want to be held to account for it. So it suits their interest.
They don't want to be punished for basically all the dirty things they have done. But also it's politically motivated. It can anger people. Like the Tamils who are looking at this video should buy the book and read it, particularly young people, and then obviously analyse what the British role of the British imperialism. Then, in the minds of the new young generation, then it reduces the kind of, the value of the British imperialism in terms of reveals their character, and they don't want to do that either. So they wanted to cover up and say, we are for human rights, we are for democracy, etc. All the bullshit propaganda that we hear all the time from them, and that's not true, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it should inform, the next generation of Tamil activists when they approach the situation in Sri Lanka. Quite often, the British government will say they support, human rights in Sri Lanka. They want justice, accountability. I would then say to the British government, well, can we first have accountability and transparency for what Keenie Meenie did. Release the rest of the files and hold people to account for
What do you supply? Even now, what you giving them? Yeah.
I mean, it's the easiest thing for Britain to say to Sri Lanka or another country, do X, Y, and Z. It costs the UK government nothing to say that. It's far harder for the UK government to actually say, okay, this is what we did, and we apologise for it, and we'll put mechanisms in place to stop it from happening again. Those would be the much tougher demands for British people, including the Tamil community here, to make of the UK government.
Yeah, but the question is now is that the Conservative Party sometimes says, "Oh, we are for human rights and we will, and all these things and etc. etc." And then David Cameron, for example, well known, saying, "Oh, I'll do this and I'll do that." End of the day, nothing happened. But just to identifying the FCO and the British government policies, where it lies politically, is with the right wing, as long as they get their way and they're happy. They don't care about the human rights, what happens in these countries. It's the Keenie Meenie and it reveals that political aspect as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you'll see that come out through the book, not just in Sri Lanka, but in Oman, where they supported a dictator for half a century. There's constant this kind of hypocrisy and double standards. So I mean, the book is, it does. Sri Lanka is one of the largest case studies in the book, but I do try and give a broader sweep of different conflicts as well. So you can see this isn't a one-off. It's, there's a pattern and there's a reason why these things repeat.
So what do you think the young people reading the book should conclude, basically? What, do they develop trust? This is just one-off thing. What they do? What can they do? What kind of understanding they should develop? What do you expect? What are you trying to teach?
No, I'm excited to see what the reactions are. I think there's probably lots of directions people could take it in, and I look forward to seeing what people do.
In terms of how do they, do you think that if they kind of, for example, some people would defend the Sri Lankan government, some people would, quite a number of people would defend the British government and say there is a trust in the British government. A number of organisations also kind of trust them. Is it valid given the revelation and the character that you are portraying?
I think this book will pose serious questions for people who hold those views. I think
they could shake it off after reading this book.
they might do, but I think there's lots in there for people to reflect on.
The thing is, question about yourself is that you've done a lot of research for this. You've travelled to Sri Lanka, been met with a lot of people. It's quite a long time you've been doing this, working on this book, aren't you? Yeah,
it's taken, yes, on and off the last 7 years.
Really, 7 years of work, quite a lot. So you summarized everything, or you're going to bring another book, or you probably have enough more research to be done, more revelation can happen, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there'll be some more kind of revelations that follow on from this. I think it's the most comprehensive account of Keenie Meenie's history that I can give at this point.
You fearful of your security? Not just the Sri Lankan government, but also the British government. They won't like it, won't they?
I guess in some circles it will be unpopular, but I guess it gets a debate going, and people can engage with it, and we can have a discussion.
Okay, very good. The thing is, this book is published this month by Pluto Press.
Yeah,
it's called Keenie Meenie. It's going to be the Keenie Meenie going to be famous among the Tamil young generation.
Yeah,
shall not forget that history. Very important to understand what actually happening. The killing and the method and the madness. Where does it come from? Who trained them? Why they did it? It's not just the mere madness of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, but it's an organized approach. There is a politics behind it. All these questions are very important. This book published this month by Pluto Press, written by Phil Miller.
And on Sunday, the 9th of February, that's something people can do, is come to the event.
Sunday, yes.
We're organising at the Indian YMCA.
Indian YMCA is near Tottenham Court Road. Those have a look at the Facebook and also at the site, Ether Media website and pages, etc. You will see we will advertise it. Already number of reviews you can also read in Guardian and many other things. We will also post those things, and we also post the trailer of this film. You can have a look at it. On the 9th of Sunday, February, please don't miss this particular meeting in YMCA, Indian YMCA. It will be from 2 to 5. 2 p.m. Get there early, on time. There'll be a series of speakers, reviews, and discussion in terms of more information about what happened, etc. You can come and ask questions, take part in the discussion, buy a book, buy a signed copy from Phil Miller. Will be there, summing up the discussion as well. So please don't miss. That's on the Sunday 9th, 2 p.m. Come along. So it's a very brief interview. Thanks for coming, Phil. We will have more. We will talk more about it as the discussion going, and then we will see if Sri Lankan government or anybody react to this, and then what happens and so on. Because nobody's held accountable for these killings and the manners that developed since then as well. So in a way, recording this history is very, very important. Thanks, Phil.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.